Hi, my name is Emma Rowe. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education at Deakin University, and I'm located on Burwood campus in Melbourne. A guiding principle of our school funding model is that, going back all the way back to the 1960s and 1970s, is our school funding model is based on the concept of need, on paper at least. It has always been guided by the concept of need. So this is a really important cornerstone of our school funding model, that it has always, supposedly or on paper, been guided by the principle of need. So that's why we first started funding private schools, was because there was an argument that they needed funding. They were disadvantaged, and so they needed new libraries. So it has always been guided by this concept of need. And we see this concept throughout our really important policies or directions, such as the 1973 Carmel report or the 2011 Gonski report. And we saw this concept of need gather more and more pace. So now we have needs-based recurrent funding, and we have a funding formula. And it's all supposedly based around this careful measuring of needs, so we are responsive, and we're funding for context and disadvantage. So that's on paper how we are guided in terms of our fundamental principles or decisions that we make in relation to school funding. In practice, whether this happens is another question. But it's also important to remember that we have three forms of funding, essentially, and that is recurrent funding, and that's needs-based, and that is based on a needs-based formula, or the SRS. And then we have capital funding, and then we have private funding. So we have three forms of funding that come into schools. So only one out of three is actually needs-based. So it's actually attached to a measure of need in a formal way. Two out of three forms of funding are not tied to any needs-based measure. So, if we think about it in that way, that two out of three forms of funding are not attached to any needs-based measure, we can start to see real problematics in the way that we fund schools. That whilst we like to think of it as needs-based, it is very much the opposite of being needs-based. There are three very clear problems in our school funding model. The first one is perhaps the most obvious, that recurrent funding targets are not currently being met. And the best we can do is the promise that they'll be met in, I think it's 7 years. The promise that they'll be met in the future, pending a particular political party's success. So that seems quite questionable or intangible to me. But that's the very first one. Recurrent funding targets for public schools are not being met, except for the Australian Capital Territory. That's the only jurisdiction that's actually meeting them. So if we're thinking about funding for need, we're absolutely missing that target, and it's widely acknowledged and understood. It's not a contentious statement. We're not hitting the recurrent funding targets. So that's clearly the first one that we could do. Recurrent funding targets should be met tomorrow, or they should be met yesterday. It shouldn't be a promise of 7 years down the track, pending a political party's success. The second one that is perhaps a really good one, or it's a problem, that capital funding is not tied to any formal needs-based measure. There are guidelines on capital funding, but there's no actual measure. It's not tied to, capital funding is not actually tied to any sort of needs-based measure. So I definitely think, there's definitely a good way forward in terms of ensuring that capital funding is not ad hoc. It is applied the same way across jurisdictions. At the moment, it's not. and make sure that there's a formula for capital funding that ensures that it's far more equitable, because the current system, when it comes to capital funding, is heavily flawed, and we're really seeing public schools losing out in terms of capital funding in particular. The other one is private income. Australia relies on private income a lot more than other countries in its education systems, and in our education system, and parents are contributing a lot more on average for education. So this actually constitutes a really important form of income that's coming into schools that we need to consider in relation to needs-based funding models. So this has been reviewed in the past in relation to the capacity to contribute, in relation to government funding for private schools. There has been recommendations that funding should be tied to tuition fees, and that got knocked back. But we really should put this back on the table in terms of considering tuition fees and tying tuition fees to government funding. Going back to 3 forms of funding, 2 out of 3 are not needs-based at all. And we need to ensure that if our funding model truly is needs-based, there are definitely key steps that we could take to ensure that it is actually needs-based in practice, rather than this theoretical concept at the moment, that it's needs-based is far more theoretical than it is empirical in terms of actually occurring. There absolutely needs to be more accountability we're talking about these are schools that are serving the public. They are publicly funded schools. They're providing compulsory education. So we're not talking about cars. We're not talking about holiday houses or what you might see as consumer products. We're talking about places that provide compulsory education and that are really closely linked to social mobility, career outcomes, opportunities, those sorts of things. So when we're talking about schools, we should have an expectation that there will be some give and take and some accountability in terms of you're receiving public funding, then how are you serving the broader public? That should be really an underlying principle, especially if it's supposedly we're needs-based. So we are supposedly guided by being responsive to need. But, currently what we've got right now, the only string attached to the funding that private schools received, they've got three requirements. But the first one is the Australian curriculum. They have to adhere to the Australian curriculum. And then the next 2 are related to NAPLAN. So they must participate in NAPLAN and they must report NAPLAN. So we have 3, you could say strings attached. But in my view, my argument, these are not sufficient strings attached, because there are really what research tells us is that there are key things you should be regulating or requiring from schools that take public money, which is student enrollment or the admission processes. So how schools select students, basically, student selectivity. And then the other one you should be regulating is tuition fees as well. So that's kind of 2 key areas that we should be looking at in terms of regulation. If schools are taking public funding, then really a central authority, such as a Department of Education, that's often like the normal one, but a central authority really should be determining their intake. The private school itself should not be the ones determining their intake and making their own rules about who they take and who they don't take. It really should be the same system that is applied across the board Same for public schools as is for private schools. If you're getting public funding, then there should be some accountability for your student selection practices. So there are ways as well to incentivize schools to enroll certain students and all those sorts of things. But most countries would prohibit overt student selection. So I'm sure covert student selection, will probably always continue to a certain degree. But there are lots of things we can do to ensure that, we don't have overt student selection, whereas very much everyone knows that if you apply to a private school, they're the ones selecting you, and it can be extremely competitive to get into certain schools, as a lot of parents will say. If you want to get into a certain school, it's not you choosing that school, it's whether the school chooses you, and whether you look good enough on paper, or whether you bring enough financial resources to that school. So it's too much power there in terms of their ability to choose, especially when they're receiving public money. So I think that's the issue, because you can have private schools. I think I'm not really opposed to private schools. It's the fact that they're private but also being publicly funded. They're also not paying taxes, so they're not really giving back to the public. In my view, they're very extractive of public resources, and not serving a broad enough range of the public. People will argue that point with me, but elite private schools, there's such a diversity of private schools, of course, but elite private schools overwhelmingly cater to highly advantaged families, and that's not surprising given the tuition fees. So definitely, and there's low SES private schools as well. There's quite a broad range, but definitely, if you're getting public funding, then you should be giving back to the public, and there should be far more expectation in terms of that, the expectation to give back and serve the public, yeah, rather than it being a very one-way street in terms of taking a lot of funding, and a lot of capital funding. What research is telling us is that private schools actually receive higher levels of capital funding in contrast to public schools. It's antithesis to the concept of need to effectively incentivize parents to pay for compulsory education. The two are not going to work in conjunction together. They're always going to be at battle together. So, we do need to try and regulate or control it as much as possible, the amount of private income coming into the system. But it's just the system is not working for the broad majority, in my view. You see that private school tuition fees are increasing at exorbitant rates, and that's because they can. If it continues like this, they will just only continue increasing. There's no reason to think they will stop increasing. So, in order to have more power actually back to the voting public, it actually is a case of making the system more equitable for everyone, and then it will work better for everyone.